Good afternoon. Happy Monday, everybody. I'm Charlotte, and this is Quarantine Storytime. We have been reading War and Peace, and while we've been doing our best to stay healthy, safe, and continuing to fight for equality and remembering those around the world who have it a lot worse than us, and doing what we can to just spread knowledge and love and all the best things. Hey! I have a live chat up, so feel free to say hi. Hey, Mom, what's up? My mom, my regular watcher. I feel like there's always someone else on as well, but they never say hi. So I don't know who you are, stranger, but thank you for watching. Thank you all for watching. We're making great progress, guys. We're almost at the end of Volume 3, and then we just have Volume 4. So we have about just a little over 300 pages left, which sounds like a lot. But I have every confidence, especially because I'm going to be stepping up the reading. They're going to be a little longer, as you may have noticed last week. Instead of being half an hour and sometimes 45 minutes, they're going to be more like 45 minutes to an hour, maybe even a little bit over an hour on certain days, which brings me to today. Today we're going to read Volume 3, Part 3, Section 24 through 28. But depending on how it goes, because sometimes some sections they move a little faster, either because there's a lot of translation that I just skip, or like a lot of dialogue that I just skip right to the translation, or vice versa, or like more dialogue versus like long lengthy descriptions tends to move faster. So depending on how it moves, I may throw in section 29 as well. And the only reason I didn't put it in is because 29 is like technically about 9 pages, but they're definitely like shorter pages where there's like a lot of dialogue or like a lot of translation, like big chunks of French that I'll just read the English translation of just to keep things moving. So, like I said, we're going to read probably for close to an hour today. So synchronize your watches, friends. But when I get to the end of 28, if it looks like we have time, I might just go ahead and read 29. And that way we can finish Volume 3 either tomorrow or Wednesday for sure. So that's my plan of attack. I hope everyone's staying safe. Hope you like that plan. And what else was I going to say? Yeah. Oh, and I put up some extra links in the video at the end, so you can check out the playlist and the descriptions in the Friday's video, or check out today's video after it's been like posted to the playlist, and there'll be some links about different ways you can stay involved, either with racial justice or by supporting sending humanitarian aid to Beirut, which is greatly suffering right now. And I've had a request for Russian music in the background. I don't know if you guys can hear the piano. Evidently you can hear the piano playing in the background. I'll make some requests for tomorrow. I know there's been like some Polish, like some Chopin and some Polonaises that are being workshopped, and they'll probably also hear some exercises which aren't as interesting. But I will work on that. And I'm also working on possibly getting a microphone, so by the end of the book, we'll hopefully have a little bit of better vocal quality. The tricky thing is soundproofing this area, which may involve me building a blanket for it. So hey, fun times. But yeah, so without too much further ado, let's jump in. As you recall, Moscow has been abandoned. Napoleon has arrived at Moscow and was waiting for like a diplomatic or surrender committee to show up, but pretty much everybody just left Moscow. Especially all of like the ruling and upper class and anyone in government just like were like peace out, just like gone. So he was pretty disappointed because he had a beautiful speech prepared and he was just ready to make a big scene when they came to surrender, but nobody came, and so he was like, well, fine, jerks. And so he is in Moscow, or at least his troops are, and what's left are poor people in Moscow, and there's been some sort of there's been lots of like drinking and like little fights and skirmishes and things like that. And there's a police chief who was driving through one of the squares, and a crowd was, basically running after him and saying, let's give him an accounting. So, but like a drunken crowd. So there's a mob chasing like a police chief. And, in general, there's sort of like the poor people and the, people of lesser means left. And also seems like some scoundrels left to stir up things. So some, mob activities happening. Pierre was in disguise, hiding at his deceased mentor's place. And the Rostovs made it out. And the Countess Rostov and Sonia are hiding from Natasha the fact that Prince Andrei Bukansky is alive and badly wounded and traveling in their caravan of light carriages. So we will see what comes of all this. All right, let's jump into it. So Volume 3, Part 3, Section 24. On the evening of the 1st of September, after his meeting with Kutuzov, Count Rostopchin, upset and offended that he had not been invited to the Council of War, that Kutuzov had paid no attention to his suggestion of taking part in the defense of the capital, and astonished at the new view revealed to him in the camp in which the question of the tranquility of the capital and its patriotic spirit appeared not only secondary, but completely unnecessary and insignificant. Upset, offended, and astonished at all that, Count Rostopchin returned to Moscow. After supper, without undressing, the Count lay down on the couch and was awakened past midnight by a courier who brought him a letter from Kutuzov. The letter said that, as the troops were retreating to the Ryazan road beyond Moscow, would the Count be so good as to send police officers to lead the troops through the city? This came as no news to Rostopchin, not only since the previous day's meeting with Kutuzov on Polonaya Hill, but ever since the Battle of Borodino, when all the generals who came to Moscow said with one voice that it was impossible to offer battle, and when, with the Count's permission, government property was being evacuated every night and half the inhabitants had left, Count Rostopchin had known that Moscow would be abandoned. Nevertheless, this news, conveyed in the form of a simple note with an order from Kutuzov, and received during the night, just as he was falling asleep, astonished and vexed the Count, as you can imagine. Because, hey, it's like midnight, he's trying to go to sleep. Afterwards, explaining his activity during this time, Count Rostopchin wrote several times in his notes that he had then had two important goals: de maintenir la tranquillité à Moscow et d'en faire partir les inhabitants, to maintain the tranquility of Moscow and to get the inhabitants to leave. If we follow this double goal, every one of Rostopchin's acts turn out to be irreproachable. Why were the holy objects, the weapons, shot, powder, stores of grain, not evacuated? Why were thousands of inhabitants deceived about Moscow not being surrendered and thereby ruined? In order to maintain tranquility in the capital, reprised Count Rostopchin's explanation. Why were heaps of useless papers from government offices evacuated, along with Lepitch's balloon and other objects? In order to leave the city empty, replies Count Rostopchin's explanation. One need only allow that something threatened the tranquility of the people, and every action becomes justified. All the horrors of the Reign of Terror were based only on concern for public tranquility. On what, then, did Count Rostopchin base his fear for public tranquility in Moscow in the year 1812? What reason was there to suppose there was a tendency to revolt in the city? The inhabitants were leaving, the retreating troops were filling Moscow. Why should the result of that be a popular revolt? Neither in Moscow nor anywhere in Russia did anything resembling an insurrection occur at the entrance of the enemy. On the 1st of September, on the 2nd of September, there were more than 10,000 people still in Moscow, and apart from the crowd that gathered in the commander-in-chief's courtyard and was drawn there by the man himself, there was nothing. Obviously, there would have been still less reason to expect a disturbance among the people if, after the Battle of Borodino, when the surrender of Moscow became obvious, or at least probable, instead of stirring people up by distributing weapons and posters, Rostopchin had taken measures to evacuate all the holy objects, powder, shot, and money, and had announced directly to the people that the city would be abandoned. Rostopchin, an ardent, sanguine man who had always gone about in the highest administrative circles, though he did have patriotic feelings, did not have the least notion of the people he thought to govern. At the very beginning of the enemy's entry into Smolensk, Rostopchin had fashioned in his imagination a role for himself as a guide of popular feelings, the heart of Russia. It seemed to him, as it does to every administrator, that he was not only managing the external activities of the people of Moscow, but also guiding their mood by means of his appeals and posters, written in that boorish language which the people despise in their own milieu, and which they do not understand when they hear it from above. The beautiful role of guide of popular feeling was so much to Rostopchin's liking, he grew so accustomed to it, that the necessity of quitting that role, the necessity of abandoning Moscow without any heroic effects, caught him unawares, and he suddenly lost the ground under his feet, on which he had been standing, and decidedly did not know what he was to do. He knew, but with all his soul did not believe that until the last moment that Moscow would be abandoned, and did nothing in view of that. The inhabitants were leaving against his will. If the government offices were evacuated, it was done only on the demand of the officials, with whom the Count agreed reluctantly. He personally was concerned only with the role he had created for himself. As often happens with people gifted with an ardent imagination, he had known for a long time that Moscow would be abandoned, but had known it only with his reason, while with his soul he had not believed it. He was not transported in imagination into that new situation. All his activity, painstaking and energetic, how far it was useful and had an effect on the people is another question, was aimed only at arousing in the inhabitants the feeling he himself experienced, a patriotic hatred of the French and confidence in himself. But even when the event assumed its real historical dimensions, when a merely verbal expression of hatred of the French proved insufficient, when it was impossible to express that hatred even in battle, when self-confidence proved useless with regard to the one question of Moscow, when the entire population, as one man, abandoned their property and poured out of Moscow, showing by this negative act all the force of their national feeling, then the role chosen by Count Rostopchin suddenly proved meaningless. He suddenly felt himself alone, weak and ridiculous, with no ground under his feet. While having been awakened from sleep, he received the cold and peremptory note from Kutuzov. Rostopchin felt the more vexed, the more he felt himself to blame. All that he had precisely been charged with, all the government property he was supposed to have evacuated, was still in Moscow. To evacuate everything was impossible. Who is to blame? Who allowed this to happen, he thought. Certainly not I. I had everything ready. I held Moscow like this, and see what they've brought things to. Scoundrels. Traitors, he thought, without defining very well who those scoundrels and traitors were, but feeling it necessary to hate whoever the traitor might be who were to blame for the false and ridiculous position he was in. All night, Count Rostopchin gave orders, for which people came to him from all ends of Moscow. Those close to him had never seen him so gloomy and irritated. Your Excellency, we've come from the Department of Records, from the Director for Instructions, from the Consistory, from the Senate, from the University, from the Foundling Hospital. The auxiliary bishop has sent. He asks, what are your orders for the fire brigade? The warden of prison. The warden of the madhouse. All night announcements kept coming to the Count. To all these questions the Count gave brief and angry replies, showing that his instructions were no longer needed, that everything he had so carefully prepared had been spoiled by someone, and that this someone would bear all the responsibility for everything that was happening now. Well, tell that blockhead, he replied to the request from the Department of Records, that he should stay and keep watch over his documents. What's that nonsense you say about the fire brigade? They've got horses. Let them go to Vladimir. No, leaving them to the French. Your Excellency, the superintendent of the insane asylum is here. What are your instructions? My instructions? Let them all leave, that's all, and let the madmen go free in the city. If we've got madmen commanding the armies, these will fill the bill too. To his question about the convicts in prison, the Count shouted angrily at the warden. What, do you want me to give you a convoy of 2 battalions that don't exist? Let them go free, and enough. These are political prisoners, Your Excellency. Meshkov, Vereshchagin. Vereshchagin, he hasn't been hanged yet, cried Rostopchin. Bring him to me. Section 25. By 9 o'clock in the morning, when troops were already moving through Moscow, no one came anymore to ask the Count for instructions. Everyone who could go was going on his own. Those who stayed decided on their own what they should do. The count ordered horses prepared in order to go to Sokolniki, and frowning, yellow, and taciturn, sat in his office with folded arms. To every administrator in peaceful, unstormy times, it seemed that the entire population entrusted to him moves only by his efforts, and in this consciousness of his necessity, every administrator finds the chief reward for his labors and efforts. It is understandable that, as long as the historical sea is calm, it must seem to the ruler-administrator, in his frail little bark, resting his pole against the ship of the people and moving along with it, that his efforts are moving the ship. But once the storm rises, the sea churns up, and the ship begins to move by itself, and then the delusion is no longer possible. The ship follows its own enormous, independent course. The pole does not reach the moving ship, and the ruler suddenly, from his position of power, from being a source of strength, becomes an insignificant, useless, and feeble human being. Rostopchin felt that, and it irritated him. The police chief, whom the crowd had stopped, entered the count's study along with the adjutant, who came to announce that the horses were ready. Both were pale, and the police chief, having reported that his mission had been accomplished, told the count that a large crowd of people was standing in the courtyard and wished to see him. Rostopchin, without a word of reply, stood up and with quick steps headed for his bright, luxurious drawing room and went to the door of the balcony, took hold of the handle, let go again, and went to the window from which the whole crowd was better seen. The tall fellow was standing in front, waving his arm with a stern look and saying something. The blood-smeared blacksmith was standing next to him with a gloomy air. Through the closed windows came the noises of voices. "Is the carriage ready?" asked Rostopchin, stepping away from the window. "Yes, Your Excellency," said the adjutant. Rostopchin again went to the door of the balcony. "What do they want?" he asked the police chief. "They say, Your Excellency, that they have gathered on your orders to go against the French. They shouted something about treason. It's a violent crowd, Your Excellency. I barely got away. Your Excellency, I venture to suggest—" "Kindly leave. I know what to do without you," Rostopchin cried angrily. He looked at the door of the balcony, looking at the crowd. "See what they've done to Russia. See what they've done to me," Rostopchin thought, feeling an irrepressible wrath rising in his soul against someone to whom he could ascribe the cause of all that was happening. As often happens with hot-tempered people, wrath had already taken hold of him, and he was still seeking an object for it. "Le voilà le populace, la du peuple," he thought, looking at the crowd. Le plebe, qu'ils on se lève par leur sottise, il leur fait une victime. It occurred to him as he looked at the tall fellow swinging his arm, and it occurred to him precisely because he needed that victim himself, that object for his wrath. "Is the carriage ready?" he asked once more. "Yes, Your Excellency. What are your orders concerning Vereshchagin?" "He's waiting by the porch," said the adjutant. "Ah!" cried Rostopchin, as if struck by some unexpected recollection. And, quickly opening the door, he stepped resolutely onto the balcony. The talking suddenly ceased. Hats and caps were taken off, and all eyes were raised to the emerging count. "Greeting, lads," the count said quickly and loudly. "Thank you for coming. I'll come out to you presently, but first of all we must deal with the villain. We must punish the villain who has brought down the ruin to Moscow. Wait for me." And the count went inside just as quickly, slamming the door. An approving murmur of satisfaction ran through the crowd. "It means he'll deal with all the villains. And you say Frenchman? He'll undo the whole distance for you," people said, as if reproaching each other for lack of faith. A few minutes later, an officer came hastily out of the front door, gave some order, and the dragoons stood to attention. The crowd eagerly moved from the balcony towards the porch. Coming out to the porch with wrathfully quick steps, Rostopchin hastily looked around as if seeking someone. "Where is he?" said the count, and the moment he said it, he saw coming around the corner of the house, between two dragoons, a young man with a long, thin neck, half of his head shaved and covered with new stubble. This young man was dressed in a once foppish but now shabby coat of dark blue broadcloth, lined with fox fur, and dirty canvas convict's trousers, tucked into unpolished, thin, down at the heels boots. Irons hung heavily on his thin, weak legs, hampering the young man's irresolute steps. "Ah!" said Rostopchin, hastily turning his gaze from the young man in the fox fur coat and pointing to the lowest step of the porch. "Put him there!" The young man, clanking his irons, climbed heavily onto the porch indicated, pulled with his fingers at the chafing collar of his coat, and turned his long neck twice, and with a sigh folded his slender, non-working hands over his stomach in a submissive gesture. For a few minutes, while the young man was settling himself on the step, the silence continued. Only in the back rows from among the people pressing towards that one point came grunts, groans, and the sound of shoving and the stamping of shifting feet. Rostopchin, waiting for the man to stand still on the appointed place, frowningly rubbed his face with his hand. "Lads," Rostopchin said in a ringing metallic voice, "this man, Vereshchagin, is the very scoundrel who has brought ruin to Moscow." The young man in the fox fur coat stood in a submissive pose, stooping slightly, his hands clasped together over his stomach. His emaciated young face, with a hopeless expression disfigured by the shaven head, was lowered. At the Count's final words, he slowly raised his head and looked at him from below as if wishing to say something to him, or at least meet his eyes, but Rostopchin was not looking at him. On the young man's long, thin neck, behind his ear, a vein swelled like a cord and turned blue, and his face suddenly reddened. All eyes were directed at him. He looked at the crowd and, as if encouraged by the expression he read on the people's faces, smiled sadly and timidly, and lowering his head again, began shifting his feet on the step. "He has betrayed his Tsar and his fatherland. He has gone over to Bonaparte. He alone of all Russians has disgraced the Russian name. And he has brought ruin on Moscow," Rostopchin was saying in a flat, shrill voice. But suddenly he gave a quick glance down at Vereshchagin, who went on standing in the same submissive pose. It was as if this glance blew him up. Raising his arm, he almost shouted, turning to the people, "Deal summarily with him! I hand him over to you!" The people were silent and only pressed closer and closer from behind, to hold on to each other, to breathe in that infected atmosphere, having no strength to stir, and to wait for something unknown, incomprehensible, and dreadful, was becoming unbearable. The people standing in the front rows, seeing and hearing all that was going on before them, with frightened, wide-open eyes and gaping mouth, strained with all their forces to hold back the pressures of those behind them. "Beat him! Let the traitor perish and not disgrace the Russian name," Rostopchin began shouting. "Cut him down! I order it!" Hearing not the words, but the wrathful sound of Rostopchin's voice, the crowd groaned and moved closer, but stopped again. "Count!" Rostopchin's voice, timid and at the same time theatrical, said in a momentary silence that again ensued. "Count, there is one God over us," said Vereshchagin. And raising his head, and again the fat vein on his thin neck swelled with blood, and color quickly rose to his face and left it again. He did not finish what he wanted to say. "Cut him down, I order it!" Rostopchin shouted out, suddenly turning as pale as Vereshchagin. "Sabers out!" the officer cried to the dragoons, drawing his own saber. Another, still stronger wave swept over the people, and reaching the front rows, this wave pushed those in front and carried them, swaying, to the very steps of the porch. The tall fellow, with a stony expression on his face and his arm permanently raised, stood beside Vereshchagin. "Cut him down!" the officer almost whispered to the dragoons, and one of the soldiers, his face disfigured by rage, suddenly struck Vereshchagin on the head with the flat of his broadsword. "Ah!" Vereshchagin cried out briefly and surprisedly, looking around in fright as though he could not understand why this thing had been done to him. The same groan of surprise and horror passed through the crowd. "Oh, Lord!" someone cried ruefully. But after the exclamation of surprise that escaped Vereshchagin, he uttered a pitiful cry of pain, and that cry was the end of him. The barrier of human feeling, strained to the utmost in holding back the crowd, instantly broke. The crime had begun. It was necessary to go through with it. The pitiful moan of reproach was stifled by the menacing and wrathful roar of the crowd. Like the seventh and last wave that breaks upon ships, that last irrepressible wave surged from the back rows, raced towards the front, knocked them down, and engulfs everything. The dragoon who struck Vereshchagin was about to repeat his blow. Vereshchagin, with a cry of terror, shielding himself with his hands, rushed towards the people. The tall fellow whom he ran into seized Vereshchagin's thin neck with his hands, and uttering a wild cry, fell with him under the feet of the pushing, tearing people. Some beat and tore at Vereshchagin, others at the tall fellow, and the shouts of the crushed man and of those who were trying to save the tall fellow only excited the fury of the crowd. For a long time, the dragoons were unable to free the factory worker, bloody, beaten almost to death, and for a long time, despite all the feverish haste with which the crowd tried to finish the thing they had begun, the people who beat, strangled, and tore at Vereshchagin were unable to kill him, and the crowd pressed at them from all sides, with them in the middle, heaving from side to side like a single mass, and not giving them the opportunity either to finish him off or abandon him. Hit him with an axe or something! Crush him! The traitor! He sold Christ! Alive! Living! Serves the thief right! Use a bar! Is he alive? And only when the victim ceased to struggle and his cries were replaced by a drawn-out, rhythmic wheezing did the crowd hurriedly begin moving around the prone, blood-stained body. Everyone went up, glanced at what had been done, and with horror, reproach, and astonishment, pressed back again. "Oh, Lord, the people are like beasts. How could he be alive?" was heard in the crowd. "And he's a young fellow, must be a merchant. That's the people for you. They say he's not the one. How? Not the one? Oh, Lord. The other one got beaten. They say he's barely alive. People, no fear of sin," the same people now said, looking with painfully pitying expressions at the dead body with its blue face all smeared with blood and dust and its long, thin, slashed neck. An assiduous police officer, finding the presence of a corpse in His Excellency's courtyard inappropriate, ordered the dragoons to take the body outside. 2 dragoons took hold of the mangled legs and dragged the body away. The bloody, dust-smeared, dead, shaven head, lulled on its long neck, trailed on the ground. The people shrank from the corpse. As Vereshchagin fell, and the crowd, with its wild roar, closed and swayed over him, Rostopchin suddenly turned pale, and instead of going to the back entrance where the horses were waiting for him, he lowered his head, and not knowing where or why himself, went quickly down the corridor that led to the ground floor rooms. The Count's face was pale, and he could not stop the feverish trembling of his lower jaw. "Your Excellency, this way. Where are you going?" "This way, please," a trembling, frightened voice said behind him. Rostopchin was unable to make any reply, and turning obediently, went where he was told. A calèche was standing by the back entrance. The distant noise of the roaring crowd was heard there too. Count Rostopchin hurriedly got into the calèche and ordered that he be taken to his country house in Sokolniki. Driving out to the Myasnitskaya and no longer hearing the cries of the crowd, the Count began to have regrets. He now recalled with displeasure the agitation and fear he had shown before his subordinates. "La populace est terrible. Elle est hideuse," he thought in French. "Ils sont comme les loups, qu'on ne peut apaiser qu'avec de la chair." "Count, there is one God over us." He suddenly remembered Vereshchagin's words, and an unpleasant sensation of chill ran down Count Rostopchin's spine. But the sense was momentary, and Count Rostopchin smiled scornfully at himself. "J'avais d'autres devoirs," he thought. "Il fallait apprécier le peuple. Bien de les autres victimes ont péri et périssant pour le bien public." And he began to think about those general responsibilities he had in relation to his family, to his entrusted to him, capital, and about himself, not as Fyodor Vasilyich Rostopchin. He supposed that Fyodor Vasilyich Rostopchin had sacrificed himself for the bien public, but as commander-in-chief, representative of the authorities and the Tsar's plenipotentiary. If I were merely Fyodor Vasilyich, ma ligne de conduite aurait été tout autrement facile, but I had to preserve the life and dignity of the commander-in-chief. Rocking silently on the soft springs of his calèche, and no longer hearing the dreadful sounds of the crowd, Rostopchin calmed down physically, and, as always happens, simultaneously with physical calm, his mind also devised causes for him to be morally calm. The thought that calmed Rostopchin was not new. As long as the world had existed and people have been killing each other, no one man has ever committed a crime upon his own kind without calming himself with this same thought. This thought was le bien public, the supposed good of other people. For a man not gripped by passion, that good is never known, but the man who commits the crime always knows for certain what that good consists in, and Rostopchin now knew it. In his reasoning, he not only did not reproach himself for his action, but even found cause for self-satisfaction in having been able to make use so successfully of this à-propos to punish the criminal and at the same time calm the crowd. Vereshchagin was tried and sentenced to death, thought Rostopchin, though the Senate had only sentenced Rostopchin to hard labor. He was a traitor and a turncoat. I couldn't let him go unpunished, and besides, Je faisais d'un père du corps. For the sake of calm, I gave the people a victim and punished a villain. On reaching his country house and busying himself with household instructions, the Count became perfectly calm. Half an hour later, the Count was driving with fast horses across the Sokolniki field, no longer recalling what had happened, and thinking and considering only what was going to happen. He was now driving to the Yaoski Bridge, where he had been told Kutuzov was. Rostopchin was planning in his imagination those wrathful and stinging reproaches he would make to Kutuzov for his deception. He would give that old fox of a courtier to feel that the responsibility for all the misfortunes that would proceed from the abandoning of the capital, from the ruin of Russia, as Rostopchin thought, would lie solely on his old, senile head. Thinking over beforehand what he was going to tell him, Rostopchin turned wrathfully in the caleche and glanced angrily to both sides. The Sokolniki field was deserted. Only at the end of it, by the hospice and the madhouse, could bunches of men in white clothes be seen, and several solitary ones dressed in the same way, walking across the field, shouting something and waving their arms. One of them ran to intercept Count Rostopchin's caleche, and Count Rostopchin himself and his driver and the dragoons all looked with a vague feeling of horror and curiosity at these released madmen, and especially at the one who was running towards them. Swaying on his long, thin legs, his robe flying, the madman was running headlong, his eyes fixed at Rostopchin, shouting something to him in a hoarse voice and making signs for him to stop. The madman's somber and solemn face, overgrown with uneven tufts of beard, was thin and yellow. His jet-black pupils shifted low and anxiously in their saffron-yellow whites. "Wait! Stop, I tell you!" he called out piercingly, and then cried something else, breathlessly, with imposing intonations and gestures. He drew even with the carriage and ran alongside it. "Thrice they killed me. Thrice I rose from the dead. They have stoned me. They have crucified me. I shall rise. Rise, rise. They have rent my body. The kingdom of God will be destroyed. Thrice will I destroy it. Thrice will I rise it up," he cried, raising his voice more and more. Count Rostopchin suddenly grew pale, just as he had grown pale when the crowd fell on Vereshchagin. He turned away. Drive faster," he cried to the coachman in a trembling voice. The carriage raced as fast as the horses could pull it, but for a long time Count Rostopchin heard the ever more distant, mad, desperate shouting, and before his eyes saw only the surprised, frightened, bloody face of the traitor in the fur-lined coat. Fresh as that memory was, Rostopchin felt that it was now deeply, bloodily engraved in his heart. He felt clearly now that the bloody trace of that memory would never heal, but that, on the contrary, the longer he lived, the more cruelly and tormentingly that terrible memory would live in his heart. He now fancied he could hear the sound of his own words. "Cut him down, or you'll answer to me with your heads." Why did I say those words? They came out somehow accidentally. I might not have said them, he thought. Then nothing would have happened. He saw the frightened and then suddenly cruel face of the dragoon who struck him, and the look of silent, timid reproach cast at him by that boy in the fox-lined coat. "But I didn't do it for myself. I had to act that way. Le plebe, le traiteur, le bien public," he thought. Troops were still crowding around the Yaoski Bridge. It was hot. Kutuzov, frowning, glum, was sitting on a bench by the bridge and playing in the sand with his whip when a caleche noisily galloped up to him. A man in a general's uniform, in a plumed hat, his shifting eyes, either wrathful or frightened, came up to Kutuzov and began saying something to him in French. It was Count Rostopchin. He said to Kutuzov that he had come there because Moscow and the capital were no more and there was only the army. It would be different if your serenity had not told me you would not surrender Moscow without offering another battle. None of this would have happened, he said. Kutuzov was looking at Rostopchin and, as if not understanding the meaning of the words being addressed to him, was trying hard to read something special written at that moment on the face of the man who was speaking to him. Rostopchin, embarrassed, fell silent. Kutuzov shook his head silently and, not taking his searching gaze from Rostopchin's face, said softly, "No, I won't give up Moscow without offering battle." Whether Kutuzov was thinking of something completely different as he said those words, or he spoke them deliberately, aware of their meaninglessness, Count Rostopchin said nothing and hastily walked away from Kutuzov. And, strange thing, the commander-in-chief of Moscow, the proud Count Rostopchin, took a whip in his hand, went to the bridge, and began shouting and dispersing the clustering carts. Section 26. Towards 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Murat's troops were entering Moscow. At their head rode a detachment of Württemberg hussars. On horseback behind them, with a large suite, rode the King of Naples himself. Around the middle of the Arbat, by St. Nicholas the Revealed, Murat stopped to wait for news from the advanced detachment about the state of things in the city's fortress, Le Kremlin. A small bunch of people from among the inhabitants who had remained in Moscow gathered around Murat. They all looked with timid perplexity at the strange, long-haired commander adorned with feathers and gold. "What, is he the Tsar himself or something? Not bad," quiet voices were heard. An interpreter rode up to the bunch of people. "Take your hats off. Your hat," they said in the crowd, addressing each other. The interpreter returned to an old yard porter and asked if it was far to the Kremlin. The yard porter, listening in perplexity to the Polish accent, which was foreign to him, and not recognizing the sounds of the interpreter's talk as Russian speech, did not understand what was being said to him and hid behind the others. Murat approached the interpreter and told him to ask where the Russian troops were. One of the Russians understood what was asked, and several voices suddenly began to answer the interpreter. A French officer from the advanced detachment rode up to Murat and reported that the gates of the fortress were closed, and there was probably an ambush inside. "Very well," said Murat, and turning to one of the gentlemen of his suite, he ordered 4 light guns moved forward to fire at the gates. The artillery trotted out from behind the column, following Murat, and went along the Arbat. Going down to the end of the Dzhezhenka Street, the artillery stopped and lined up at the square. Several French officers took charge of the guns, setting them up and looking at the Kremlin through field glasses. Inside the Kremlin, the bells were ringing from vespers, and this ringing confused the French. They supposed it was a call to arms. Several infantrymen ran to the Kutafievsky gates. In the gateway lay beams and wooden screens. 2 musket shots rang out from the gateway, and as soon as an officer with a unit began running towards it, the general, who stood by the guns, shouted a command, and the officer and soldiers came running back. 3 more shots were heard from the gateway. One grazed a French soldier's leg, and a strange shouting of a few voices came from behind the screens. On the faces of the French general, officers, and soldiers, the former expression of cheerfulness and calm was replaced all at once, as if on command, by the stubborn, concentrated expression of a readiness to fight and suffer. For all of them, from marshal to the last soldier, this place was not the Vizhdevenka, Mokolvaya, and Kutufaya, and the Troitsky gates, but the new terrain of a new and probably bloody battle. They were all prepared for that battle. The shouting from the gateway ceased. The guns were moved forward. The artillery blew the snuff from their wicks. The officer commanded, "Phew!" and the whistling sounds of 2 tin canisters rang out one after another. Shots rattled against the stone of the gateway, the beams, the screens, and 2 clouds of smoke billowed over the square. A few moments after the rolling of the shots over the stone Kremlin, moments after the rolling of the shots over the stone Kremlin died away, a strange noise was heard over the heads of the French. A huge flock of jackdaws rose above the walls, and crowing and flapping thousands of wings circled in the air. Along with that sound came a solitary human shout in the gateway, and from behind the smoke appeared the figure of a man without a hat, wearing a kaftan. He was holding a musket and aiming at the French. "Phew!" repeated the artillery officer, and 1 musket shot and 2 cannon shots rang out simultaneously. Smoke again covered the gateway. Nothing stirred any more behind the screens, and the French soldiers and officers, walked up to the gates. In the gateway lay 3 wounded and 4 dead men. 2 men in kaftans were fleeing along the foot of the wall towards Znamenka Street. "Enlevez-moi ça," said the officer, pointing to the beams and the corpses, and the French, having finished off the wounded, threw the corpses down behind the fence. Who these men were, no one knew. "Enlevez-moi ça" was all that was said of them, and they were thrown out and taken away later so that they would not stink. Theirs alone devoted a few eloquent lines to their memory. Ces misérables avaient envahi la citadelle sacrée, s'éteintent en paresse des fusils, des arsenals et tirèrent ces misérables sur les Français. On en sabra quelques-uns et on purgait le crime de leur puissance. These wretches had invaded the sacred citadel, and taken guns from the arsenal, and had fired, the wretches, on the French. Some were put to the sword, and the Kremlin was purged of their presence. It was reported to Murat that the way had been cleared. The French entered the gates and began setting up camp on Senate Square. Soldiers threw chairs out of the windows of the Senate onto the square and built campfires. Other detachments passed along the Kremlin and settled along Matrosekka, Lubyanka, and Pavlovka Street. Still others settled along the Vizhnevenka, Znamenka, Nikolskaya, and Tverskaya. The French, finding no owners, settled everywhere, not as in quarters in a town, but as in a camp located in a town. Though ragged, famished, exhausted, and reduced to a third of their former number, the French soldiers still entered Moscow in an orderly manner. This was an exhausted, emaciated, but still warlike and menacing army. But it was an army only until the moment when the soldiers of that army dispersed to quarters. As soon as the men of the regiments began to disperse among the empty and wealthy houses, the army was annihilated forever, and what emerged was neither inhabitants nor soldiers, but something between the two, known as looters. When the same men left Moscow 5 weeks later, they no longer constituted an army. They were a mob of looters, each of whom drove or carried with him a heap of things that seemed valuable or useful to him. The goal of each of these men, as they were leaving Moscow, did not consist, as before, in conquering, but only in keeping what they had acquired. Like the monkey who, putting his head into the narrow mouth of the jug and seizing a handful of nuts, will not open its fist, so as not to lose what it has seized, and thereby perishes, so the French, in leaving Moscow, were obviously bound to perish as a result of dragging their loot with them. But to abandon that loot was as impossible for them as for the monkey to let go of its handful of nuts. 10 minutes after any French regiment entered some quarter of Moscow, there was not a single soldier or officer left. In the windows of the houses, people in greatcoats and leggings could be seen laughing and strolling through the rooms. In cellars and basements, the same sort of people were bustling about with provisions. In the courtyards, the same sort of people opened or broke down the gates of sheds and stables. In the kitchens, they made fires, and with their sleeves rolled up, baked, kneaded, and cooked, frightened, amused, and fondled the women and children. And there were many of these people everywhere in the shops and houses, but there was no more army. On that same day, the French commanders issued order after order forbidding the troops to disperse through the city, strictly forbidding looting and violence to the inhabitants, and announcing a general roll call that very evening. But despite all such measures, the men who formerly constituted an army were spreading throughout the rich, empty city, abounding with comforts and supplies. As a hungry herd goes across a bare field in a group, but at once irrepressibly scatters as soon as it comes upon rich pasture, so the troops scattered as irrepressibly through the rich city. There were no inhabitants in Moscow, and the soldiers were absorbed by it like water by sand, and irrepressibly spread starwise in all directions from the Kremlin, which they occupied first of all. Cavalrymen, entering a merchant's house, abandoned with all its goods, and finding stalls there not only for their own horses, but extra ones as well, still went to occupy the house next door, which seemed better to them. Many occupied several houses, writing on them in chalk who the occupier was, and quarreled and even fought with other units. Before they had time to settle, the soldiers ran outside to look over the city, and hearing that everything had been abandoned, rushed wherever valuable things could be had for nothing. Officers went to stop the soldiers and were involuntarily drawn into the same acts. In Carriage Row there were abandoned shops with vehicles, and generals crowded there, picking out calèches and carriages for themselves. The remaining inhabitants invited the officers to stay with them, hoping to protect themselves from being looted. There was an abundance of riches and no end of them in sight. Everywhere around this area occupied by the French, there were other areas, unknown and unoccupied, in which, as it seemed to the French, there were still greater riches, and Moscow absorbed them into itself more and more. Just as when water is poured into dry ground, the result is that both water and dry ground disappear. So when the famished army entered the abundant, empty city, The result was that the army was annihilated and the abundant city was annihilated. There was mud, there were fires and looting. The French ascribed the burning of Moscow au patriotisme féroce de Rostopchin, the Russians to the savagery of the French. Yet in reality, with regards to the burning of Moscow, there were not and could not be any reasons for placing the responsibility for it on one or several persons. Moscow burned down because it was put into conditions in which any wooden town would have burned down, regardless of whether the town had or did not have 130 poor quality fire pumps. Moscow had burnt down because its inhabitants left it, and inevitably as a pile of wood chips has to set fire if sparks pour down on it for several days. A wooden town in which, in the presence of the inhabitants who own the houses and of the police, there are fires almost every day during the summer, cannot help burning down when there are no inhabitants there, but troops smoking pipes, making campfires on Senate Square out of Senate's chairs, and cooking meals twice a day. Billet troops in the villages of some area during peacetime, and the number of fires in that area increases at once. How much greater, then, is the possibility of fires in an empty wooden town in which foreign troops are billeted? Le patriotisme féroce de Rostopchin and the savagery of the French are not to blame for anything here. Moscow caught on fire from the pipes, the kitchens, the carelessness of enemy soldiers who were living in houses they did not own. If there was arson, which is very doubtful because no one had any reason for it, and in any case it was troublesome and dangerous, the arson cannot be taken as the cause, since without any arson it would have been the same. Flattering as it was for the French to blame the brutality of Rostopchin, and for the Russians to blame the villain Bonaparte, or later to place the heroic torch in the hands of their own people, it is impossible not to see that there could be no immediate cause for the burning, because Moscow had to burn down just as any village, any factory, any house has to burn down, which has been left by its owners, and in which strangers are allowed to take over and start cooking kasha for themselves. Moscow was burned by its inhabitants, true, but not by the inhabitants who stayed in it, but by those who left it. Occupied by the enemy, Moscow did not remain intact like Berlin, Vienna, and other cities, only because its inhabitants did not bring out bread and salt and the keys to the city for the French, but left it. Section 27. The absorption of the French, which spread starwise over Moscow, reached the neighborhood where Pierre was living only by the evening of the 2nd of September. After the past 2 days, spent solitarily and unusually, Pierre was in a state close to madness. His whole being was possessed by one important thought. He did not know how or when himself, but this thought had taken such possession of him that he could remember nothing of the past, understood nothing of the present, and everything he saw and heard went on before him as in a dream. Pierre had left his house only so as to be rid of the complicated tangle of life's demands which had taken hold of him, and which he, in the state he was in then, had been unable to disentangle. He had gone to Yosef Alexievich's house under the pretext of sorting the books and papers of the deceased, only because he was seeking refuge from life's anxieties, and the memory of Yosef Alexievich was connected in his soul with the world of eternal, calm, and solemn thoughts, and the complete opposite of the anxious tangle he found himself being pulled into. He had sought a quiet refuge, and indeed found one in Yosef Alexievich's study. When in the dead silence of the study he sat down, resting his elbow on the deceased man's dusty writing table, memories of the last days began to appear calmly and meaningfully, one after the other in his imagination, especially of the Battle of Borodino, and of that indefinable feeling of his own insignificance and falseness in comparison with the truth, simplicity, and strength of that category of people, imprinted in his soul under the name of they. When Gerasim roused him from his recollections, the thought came to Pierre that he would take part in the people's defense of Moscow, which he knew was projected. And with that purpose, he had at once asked Gerasim to obtain a kaftan and a pistol for him, and announced to him his intention of concealing his name and staying in Yosef Alexievich's house. Later, in the course of his first day spent in solitude and idleness, Pierre tried several times, but was unable to fix his attention on Masonic manuscripts. A thought had vaguely presented itself to him several times, the same thought he had had before about the Kabbalistic connection between his name and the name of Bonaparte. But this thought that he, Le Russe Bezuhoff, was destined to set a limit to the power of the beast, still came to him only as one of those fantasies that, without cause or trace, flit through one's imagination. When, having brought a kaftan, only with the aim of participating in the people's defense of Moscow, Pierre had met the Rostovs, and Natasha had said to him, "You're staying? Oh, that's so good." The thought had flashed through his head that it would indeed be good, even if Moscow were to be taken, for him to stay there and carry on what was being predestined. The next day, with that one thought of not sparing himself and not lagging behind them in anything, he went out of the Three Hills Gate with the people. But when he returned home, convinced that Moscow would not be defended, he suddenly felt that what formerly had been only a possibility had now turned into a necessity and an inevitability. He had to remain in Moscow, concealing his name, to meet Napoleon, and to kill him, so as either to perish or to put an end to the misfortunes of all Europe, which proceeded, in Pierre's opinion, solely from Napoleon. Pierre knew all the details of a German student's attempt on the life of Bonaparte in Vienna in 1809, and knew that the student had been shot, and the danger to which he would subject his life while carrying out his intention excited him still more. Two equally strong feelings drew Pierre irresistibly to his intention. The first was the feeling of the need for sacrifice and suffering in the awareness of the general calamity, that feeling on account of which he had gone to Mozhaisk on the 25th and ended up in the very heat of battle, and had now run away from his home, and instead of the habitual luxury and comforts of life, slept on a hard couch without undressing, and ate the same food as Garrison. The other was that vague, exclusively Russian feeling of disdain for everything conventional, artificial, human, for everything that most people consider the highest good in the world. Pierre had experienced that strange and fascinating feeling for the first time in the Slobodsky Palace, when he suddenly felt that wealth and power and life, and all the people that arrange and preserve with such care, all this, if it was worth anything, is so only because of the pleasure with which one can abandon it all. It was that feeling on account of which a volunteer recruit drinks up his last kopeck. A man on a drunken binge smashes mirrors and windows without any apparent reason, and knowing that it will cost him his last penny. That feeling on account of which a man does, in the banal sense, insane things, as if testing his personal power and strength, claiming the presence of a higher judgment over life, which stands outside of human conventions. From that very day, Pierre had experienced this feeling for the first time in the Slobodsky Palace, which he had been constantly under its influence, but only now had found full satisfaction for it. Besides, at that present moment, Pierre was supported in his intention and deprived of the possibility of renouncing it by what he had already done along the path. His flight from his home, and his kaftan, and his pistol, and his declaration to the Rostovs that he would stay in Moscow, all this would not only lose its meaning, but would have become contemptible and ridiculous, to which Pierre was sensitive, if, after all that, he left Moscow like everybody else. Pierre's physical state, as always happens, coincided with his moral state. The unaccustomed, coarse food, the vodka that he had been drinking during these days, the absence of wine and cigars, dirty, unchanged linen, 2 half-sleepless nights spent on a short sofa without bedding, all this kept Pierre in a state of irritation close to insanity. It was already past 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The French were already entering Moscow. Pierre knew it, but instead of acting, he thought only about his undertaking, going through it all in the minutest details. In his reveries, Pierre did not picture vividly to himself either the process of striking the blow itself or the death of Napoleon, but with extraordinary clarity and sad enjoyment pictured to himself his own destruction and his heroic courage. Yes, one for all, I must do it or perish, he thought. Yes, I'll do it. And then suddenly, will it be a pistol or a dagger, Pierre wondered. However, it makes no difference. It is not I, but the hand of Providence that punishes you, I'll say. Pierre thought of the words he would say as he killed Napoleon. Well, so take me, punish me, Pierre went on saying to himself, with a sad but firm expression on his face, bowing his head. While Pierre stood in the middle of the room reasoning thus with himself, the door of the study opened, and on the threshold appeared the totally transformed figure of the previously always timid Makar Alexeyevich. His dressing gown hung open. His face was red and hideous. He was obviously drunk. Seeing Pierre, he was embarrassed at first, but noticing embarrassment on Pierre's face too, he at once took heart and, on staggering thin limbs, stepped into the middle of the room. They've turned coward, he said in a hoarse, trustful voice. I say, no surrender. I say, isn't it so, sir? He reflected, and suddenly, seeing the pistol on the table, seized it with unexpected swiftness and ran out to the corridor. Gerasim and the yard porter who had followed Makar Alexeyevich stopped him in the front hall and tried to take the pistol from him. Pierre came out to the corridor and with pity and revulsion looked at this half-crazy old man. Makar Alexeyevich, wincing with the effort, clutching the pistol, and cried out in a hoarse voice, clearly imagining something sullen to himself. To arms! Boredom! No, you won't take it, he cried. Enough, please, enough. Be so kind, please, leave off. Well, if you please, master, Gerasim was saying, cautiously trying to steer Makar Alexeyevich towards the door by the elbow. Who are you, Bonaparte? Cried Makar Alexeyevich. That's not nice, sir. Please go inside, have some rest. That little pistol, if you please. Away, contemptible slave. Don't touch me. See this? Cried Makar Alexeyevich, brandishing the pistol. Boredom. Grab him, Gerasim whispered to the yard porter. Makar Alexeyevich was seized by the arms and dragged towards the door. The front hall was filled with the ugly noise of the scuffle and the drunken, wheezing sounds of a breathless voice. Suddenly, a new, piercing woman's cry came from the porch, and the cook rushed into the front hall. It's them! Saints alive! It's them, by God! 4 on horseback! She cried. Gerasim and the yard porter let go of Makar Alexeyevich, and in the hushed corridor, they clearly heard the knocking of several hands on the front door. Oh dear. Section 28. Yes, here we are, 28. Pierre, having decided to himself that before carrying out his intention, he must reveal neither his rank nor his knowledge of French, stood in the half-open door to the corridor, intended to disappear as soon as the French came in. But the French came in, and Pierre still did not leave the doors. An invincible curiosity kept him there. There were 2 of them. One was an officer, tall, gallant, and handsome man. The other was obviously a soldier or an orderly, a low-slung, skinny, sunburned man with sunken cheeks and a dull expression on his face. The officer, leaning on a stick and limping slightly, came in first. Having gone several steps, the officer, as if deciding to himself that the quarters were good, stopped and turned around to the soldiers who were standing in the doorway and in a loud, commanding voice called them to bring the horses. Having finished with that, the officer, raising his elbow high in a dashing gesture, smoothed his mustache and touched his hat with his hand. Bonjour la compagnie, he said gaily, smiling and looking around him. No one made any reply. Vous êtes les bourgeois? The officer addressed Gerasim. Gerasim gave the officer a fearfully questioning look. Quartier l'Ormens, said the officer, looking at the small man from above with an indulgent and good-natured smile. Les Français sont de bons enfants. Que diable! Voyons! Ne nous fâchons pas, mon vieux, he added, patting the frightened and silent Gerasim on the shoulder. Ah ça, dites donc! On ne parle donc pas français dans cette boutique? He added, looking around and meeting Pierre's eyes. Pierre moved away from the door. The officer turned to Gerasim again. He questioned that Gerasim show him the rooms of the house. Master no hear, not understand. Major, said Gerasim, trying to make his words clearer by speaking them incorrectly. The French officer, smiling, spread his hands before Gerasim's nose, giving him to feel that he did not understand them either, and limping, walked to the door where Pierre was standing. Pierre wanted to go away and hide from him, but just then he saw Makar Alexeyevich thrusting himself out of the open kitchen door with a pistol in his hand. With a madman's cunning, Makar Alexeyevich looked the Frenchman over, raised the pistol, and took aim. Boredom! Shouted the drunk man, feeling for the trigger. The French officer turned at the shout, and at the same time, Pierre threw himself on the drunk man. Just as Pierre seized the pistol and raised it up, Makar Alexeyevich finally managed to put his finger on the trigger, and a shot rang out, deafening them all and drowning them in smoke. The Frenchman paled and rushed back to the door. Forgetting his intention not to reveal his knowledge of French, Pierre, tearing the pistol away and dropping it, ran to the officer and began speaking to him in French. Vous n'êtes pas blessé, he said. Je crois que non, replied the officer, feeling himself all over. Mais je l'ai, manque belle cette fois-ci. You're not wounded? I don't think so. But I had a lucky escape this time. Who is this man? He added, pointing to the broken plaster of the wall. Qu'est-ce cet homme? The officer asked, sternly looking at Pierre. Ah, je suis vraiment en d'espoir de ce qui vient d'arriver, Pierre said. Ah, I'm really in despair over what has just happened. He's a madman, an unfortunate who did not know what he was doing. Quickly, totally forgetting his role, c'est enfin un malheur qu'on savait pas ce qu'il faisait. The officer went up to Makar Alexeyevich and seized him by the collar. Makar Alexeyevich, slackening his lips as if falling asleep, swayed, leaning against the wall. Brigand, tu me le paieras, said the Frenchman, taking his hand away. Nous autres non sommes cléments après la victoire, mais non ne pardons pas autre traiteur. Brigand, you'll pay me for that. We are merciful after victory, but we do not pardon traitors, he added with gloomy solemnity in his face and with a handsome, energetic gesture. Pierre went on persuading the officer in French not to punish the drunken, insane man. The Frenchman listened silently without changing his gloomy look and suddenly turned to Pierre with a smile. For a few seconds he looked at him silently. His handsome face assumed a tragically tender expression and he held out his hand. Vous m'avez sauvé la vie. Vous êtes français. You have saved my life. You are French, he said. For a Frenchman, the conclusion was unquestionable. Only a Frenchman could do a great deed, and the saving of his life, the life of Monsieur Van Baal, captain de la 13 La Guerre, was without question a very great deed. But however unquestionable this conclusion and the officer's conviction based on it were, Pierre found it necessary to disappoint him. Je suis russe, he said quickly. Tut, tut, tut. Ah, d'autres, said the Frenchman, wagging his finger before his nose and smiling. Tout à l'heure, vous allez me contre tout ça, he said. Je me reconnaîtrai un compéteur. Ah bien, qu'allons nous faire de cet homme? Not to tell the others, you'll tell me about it all later. Delighted to meet a compatriot. Well, what are we going to do with this man? He added, already addressing Pierre as his own brother. Even if Pierre was not a Frenchman, having received this highest title in the world, he could not renounce it, said the tone of the French officer and the expression of his face. To the last question, Pierre explained once again who Makar Alexeyevich was, explained that just before their arrival, the drunken, insane man had stolen a loaded pistol which they had not managed to take away from him, and asked that his act go unpunished. The Frenchman thrust out his chest and made a royal gesture with his hand. Vous m'avez sauvé la vie. Vous êtes français. Vous me demandez sa grâce? Je vous l'accorde. Quand aimez ce homme? You have saved my life. You are French. You ask me for his pardon? I grant it to you. Take this man away, the Frenchman said, quickly and energetically, taking the arm of Pierre, whom he had just promoted to Frenchman for saving his life, and going into the house with him. The soldiers in the courtyard, hearing the shot, came into the front hall, asking what had happened, and showing a readiness to punish the guilty ones, but the officer sternly stopped them. On vous demandera quand on aura besoin de vous. You'll be sent for when you're needed, he said. The soldiers left. The orderly, who meanwhile had had time to visit the kitchen, came up to the officer. Capitaine, ils sont de la soupe et du grigor de mouton dans la cuisine, he said. Fait-il vous l'apporter? They have soup and a leg of mutton in the kitchen. Shall I bring them to you? Oui. Et le vin. Et le vin, said the captain. Yes, and wine. And that is the end of section 28, which is where we were going to stop today. And I think we will stop there, and we will pick it up again tomorrow. And hopefully, tomorrow I think will be a long read, but I think we kind of need to do the long read to finish off the end of volume 3, because otherwise we would have to stop and then read a little bit and then start volume 4 midway through a reading, or so buckle in for tomorrow to be a long reading. But yeah, that's today. And Pierre is now French. Just because, hey, you save someone's life, you get to change nationalities. What the heck? Why not? Pretty funny. Also, I don't know if you guys remember who Vereshchagin was. I think he was that son of the merchant who had like taken responsibility for distributing a leaflet, I think about the coming destruction of Moscow. I'll have to look back and check, because there was that, as you may recall, there was that merchant and his son, and Count Rostopchin thought he was this upstart, and he there had been like some kind of a leaflet that had been floating around that was talking about like French coming and stuff like that, and they viewed it as like traitorous. And when they, traced who it came back to him, even though there was like another leaflet published somewhere else, and they were like, "Oh, did you just steal this from like the French press and translate it?" And he was like, "No, I wrote it myself." And he refused to give up any more information other than saying he wrote it himself, so they put him in jail. I think that's who he was. The whole Vereshchagin thing. That was pretty tragic. That's kind of awful. But I think that was who that character was, if you guys recall correctly. If anyone else remembers, please feel free. I'll Google it, and after we're done reading it, and let you guys know tomorrow. But if anyone remembers off the top of your head. But otherwise, yeah, that is crazy times in Moscow, man. So what's going to happen to Pierre? Well, at least he's theoretically safe for now. Hopefully things will work out. All right. Thank you, guys. Have a great day, and I will see you tomorrow. Happy Monday.